sure you all know the story fairly well. Noah and his family construct a boat to survive a flood sent down by God himself. All the world's animals, except the pair of unicorns, board the ark and ride out the storm until the earth is safe to re-inhabit. It's a demonstration of God's power and how sin is dealt with. But the controversy lies in how this famous Genesis account is supposed to be interpreted. Was this a literal worldwide event? Was it nothing but a story? Or is some other explanation more likely? In the early 19th century, there was a general consensus among the scientific community. The earth and all of its features were representative of the biblical deluge. See, the field of geology was still fairly new, and it was devoted to proving what we would now call flood geology, or diluvialism. As William Ryan and Walter Pittman state in their book, Noah's Flood, The New Scientific Discoveries About the Event That Changed History, this was a time where science and Genesis were very much united in their interpretations of the world, and the top scientists of the time continually attributed evidence to the global flood event. However, in the 1830s, two young men, Henry Rawlinson and George Smith, worked on deciphering cuneiform engravings found on the Behistun rock by Rawlinson. To their amazement, they found an incredibly similar flood story to the one found in Genesis, except with a primitive pantheon of gods rather than the one that we know. This included specific story motifs, such as using a bird to indicate dry land, or a rainbow being a promise of the gods to never drown the earth again, all while being older than any known copy of Genesis. Smith's first thoughts were if the Israelites had simply borrowed a narrative while captive in Babylon, or perhaps if this was a culmination of thousands of years of oral storytelling. Either way, it didn't necessarily question the authority of the Bible. But it did spark interest in the scientific community. This would eventually pave the way for a more liberal interpretation of the early books of the Bible. Soon, the geologic community would get their field completely reimagined. In 1840, Louis Agassiz published Studies on Glaciers, in which he proposed many of the geologic formations that we see today are actually representative of huge glacial movements during some ancient age of ice. Evidence he used included things like boulders and the horizontal shearing of rock to indicate the grinding of huge chunks of ice. His ideas required a long amount of time, longer than the previously accepted age of the Earth. And of course, he was met with much criticism, especially from that of one of the most respected geologists of the time, Reverend William Buckland. However, once the two met at a deposit, things changed. Going to a place unknown to both of them, Agassiz used his hypothesis to predict what they would see. Once he showed the Reverend the horizontal striations in the side of a rocky outcrop, Buckland was instantly convinced of Agassiz's proposition that the apparent erosion of rocks was due to the grinding of ice and not the force of immense global floodwater, and so rejected his ideas of a global flood entirely. As years went by, Agassiz's theory became widely acclaimed, and so diluvialism began to die out in the scientific community. In contrast, further archaeological discoveries pulled support for a real flood. The discovery of Abraham's birthplace and additional flood documents all pulled support for real biblical credibility. The question now was scale. While many would disagree, there are, of course, some still believers in a global flood phenomenon. The most famous of these intense believers is Ken Ham and his construction of the Ark encounter in Kentucky. At 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet tall, this construct is a testament to how passionately some people view a literal interpretation to them. So is Ken Ham correct, and was this a worldwide flooding event? I would disagree and say that a literal interpretation of the Genesis flood is incorrect. Our world doesn't seem to reflect this idea, and because of that, the theology of it becomes dangerous. The first thing to acknowledge is how a global flood could not fit into the accepted historical timeline. Young Earth creationists have minor disputes about when exactly the flood happened, but many, including Ken Ham's ministry Answers in Genesis, place it at around 2400 BC, according to the genealogies provided by the Bible. However, this date conflicts with many of the archaeological accounts we have of many different cultures around the planet, and most predominantly in the Egyptians, who were already in their first dynasty at the time. If a global flood did happen, the Egyptians seem to have ignored the fact that they all drowned and continued writing in their complicated hieroglyphics for thousands of years prior and after, according to the Ancient History Encyclopedia. Also, the Sumerian king list is a cuneiform engraving that gives an alternate history of the Great Flood. A translation present on the electronic text corpus for Sumerian literature tells of kings that lived both before and after the flood. Some of these kings are archaeologically verifiable, also corroborating to the Epic of Gilgamesh, another flood epic. The earliest of these confirmed kings predates the 2400 BC date, yet is listed as ruling after the Great Flood was supposed to have happened. So obviously this causes some confusion. When did the flood happen? This will be explored later. Now, let's examine the Noachian floodwater itself. Is an event like this evident or even possible? To comprehend the size of an apparent global flood, we need to look to Genesis, which says that, quote, the tops of the mountains were covered at a depth of 15 cubits, end quote. Now, let's be generous and say that it only covered the tops of the mountains the people of the area would have known of. Luckily for us, the tallest is also the only one mentioned in Genesis. Mount Ararat stands at 16,800 feet tall. To put this in perspective, the average ocean depth, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is 13,000 feet. This is an absurd amount of water, and the size of such an event cannot be understated. Comparing it to other extinction events, this would be the single most disastrous event in Earth's history, besides perhaps its conception. However, some young Earth creationists claim that the entire geologic record was laid out in this single event, which would make sense. A disaster of this scale would surely be evident in the strata of our planet. However, does our world reflect this idea? There are many geologic formations today that would seem to contradict the idea of a global flood, and I don't have time to get into them all, but I will pick one of my favorites, which is ripple marks. Ripple marks are small, delicate tracts of water that track the movement of water on stone. As Carol Hill and Stephen Mosher describe in the 61st volume of Perspectives on Christian Faith and Science, quote, ripple marks are typically generated by currents moving in one direction or the to and fro motion of waves at depths of a few tens of feet at the most. However, it is unlikely that such delicate formations could have been formed and preserved under conditions of extremely rapid sediment burial at a scale imagined by flood geologists, end quote. It seems unlikely that these small, delicate structures could have been formed or preserved under such a disastrous event. But you may be inclined to ask, well, how do you even know what kind of formation such an event would create? Well, luckily for us, we do have evidence of superfloods in our geologic record, just not ones on a global scale. Dr. Victor Baker, a geologist and hydrologist, writes about a glacial superflood that occurred thousands of years ago in Washington state. Huge boulders are tossed around and giant potholes are formed as water rushes off of the edge of stone. But perhaps most importantly, gigantic ripple marks are formed. It seems that no matter the size of a water-related event, it will still leave its traces on the rocks it covers in proportion to the event's size. However, we don't see ripple marks of titanic size across all the continents, despite data suggesting that they should be frequent. But rocks are not the only thing preserved in the geologic record. Many young Earth creationists also claim that the entire fossil record was laid out in this single event. This doesn't add up, as every single species we know of fits into a specific layer of strata. Not a single organism is ever found outside of the layer it is supposed to be in, and there are no fossils attempting to swim between layers. If this flood were so torrential, how could it have laid out the plethora of species we know today in such detailed order consistently across the planet? A popular explanation is perhaps body density, but this doesn't explain it either, as the largest animals of all time, the dinosaurs, are found smack dab in the middle of the history of vertebrates. Animals of all shapes and sizes are found in every single layer, however, never any specific species cross over. Stephen Mosher, in Noah's Flood in the Grand Canyon, describes 12,000 feet of sedimentary rock in the Grand Canyon that contains nothing more complex than fossilized algae. If a global flood did happen, this could not be possible. But forget about dead animals. What about the animals that we have alive today? What kind of effect would the global floodwater have had on them? Now, it's a common belief that, of course, ocean animals didn't need to board the ark because they had all the water they need. However, if you've ever owned a saltwater fish tank, you may see where I'm going with this. Scientists at the Murray-Darling Freshwater Research Center in Australia conducted tests on different sea life populations dealing with different salt levels in their water due to different runoffs. As it turns out, marine ecology depends quite a bit on the salt concentration in their water, and falling above or below each species-specific salinity threshold could prove disastrous for their population. And so, diluting the entire ocean with an amount of rainwater that could rival the ocean itself in coverage could prove so disastrous that no sea life could hope to survive. And so, the idea of a global flood is contradicted by many geologic features and today's abundant sea life. Next, the ark itself is absolutely a target for scrutiny. Genesis 6:14 through 16 describes the ark as being 300 cubits long and 75 cubits wide, or 450 feet and 150 feet respectively. This would make it the largest wooden ship ever constructed, topping that of the largest in recorded history, the Wyoming. Zach McDore, in his article entitled Noah's Ark or the Wyoming, gives an overview of the two ships. He says that the problem arises when you examine the Wyoming itself. Despite being reinforced by steel beams and only clocking in at 329 feet long, the problem of the Wyoming was the nature of wood as a construction material. It constantly twisted and bent, causing it to leak for its entire 14-year career. With the ark being made of only wood and pitch, it seems unclear how a crew of 8 could have handled this same issue during the most torrential storm in history while also dealing with all the animals on board. Speaking of, how many animals must there have been? Well, according to PLOS Biology, there are approximately 6.5 million terrestrial species alive today, meaning that if there were 2 of each animal on board the ark, there was a minimum of 15 million occupants. This is an impossible amount of animals, and how the ark could have handled or could have fit this many animals alive in its hull for an entire year is impossible. This becomes even further complicated when some young Earth creationists claim that extinct animals such as the dinosaurs were also on board the ark. This totally undermines how rich the fossil record is. And to put that idea into perspective, Daniel Simberloff, a professor of environmental science at the University of Tennessee, says that according to new estimates, all the animals that are alive today make up approximately 1% of all life that has ever existed. This is an unimaginable amount of animals. And when interpreted literally, the ark is an impossible vessel. It's apparent the physical constraints of the global flood do not hold water. So what was it really? It must have had a kernel of truth, as the Mesopotamian flood epics are far too similar and too prevalent to completely disregard a real event. There are 2 popular explanations that include a real but localized flooding event. One is that it was an unusually large flood in the Iraqi floodplain. Basically, the immense filling of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from different runoffs after an immense rainstorm from local mountain ranges. According to the National Center for Science Education, some of the deposits in the area can support this claim, one deposit in particular being 3.4 meters thick. This surely would have been a catastrophic flood, and is dated at around 2900 BC. Another explanation is reported by William Ryan and Walter Pittman in their book, Noah's Flood, The New Scientific Discoveries About the Event That Changed History. In it, they describe a much earlier but far more disastrous flood. Ancient shorelines and core sample studies place the sea level of the Black Sea at a significantly lower level at around 5,900 BC. They propose that an inundation of the Bosphorus Strait, which connects the body of water to the Mediterranean Sea, failed and caused an immense rush of water into the area. According to Nature, computer simulations can account for some of the geologic features present at the bottom of the Black Sea, consistent with a fast and powerful influx of water. This would have quickly displaced any primitive farming populations living there, likely being the mother culture to the Babylonians, Assyrians, Akkadians, Sumerians, and eventually the Israelites. Either of these explanations are likely, and both lend themselves to the fantastical embellishments by ancient people groups. Now, it's immediately obvious what some of you may be thinking. Why even mention these physical constraints? He is God, after all. He can do anything. Fitting 15 million animals into a boat isn't an issue for the creator of the universe. And while this is true, it is my belief that this is precisely against God's character. The evidence cannot be both contradictory to the truth and also be God's doing. Let's look at a specific example. Coral reefs provide some of the best evidence against a global flood that we have. Being some of the most incredibly sensitive ecosystems on the planet, they would have surely been wiped out by the most disastrous event in history. I mean, a single human touch can wipe out huge portions of them. However, today, they remain in abundance. A notable feature of coral growth is that the current formation grows on the aged and dead pieces that preceded it. And this growth can be measured in rings, much like trees. According to Live Science, on the Great Barrier Reef, the current formation is approximately 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And it sits on nearly 500,000 years old of its predecessor coral formation. Not only this, but according to the National Center for Science Education, the rings demonstrate that this formation never underwent such a detriment that a global flood would have caused. Whether God intentionally made the rings appear older than they are, or if he protected the formation, or some other method is unclear. But what is clear is that what he has decided to show us is not in line with the proposition that a global flood happened. If we look purely at what the evidence tells us, it would suggest a global flood didn't happen. And while it is perfectly within God's power to have used miraculous technique to present the world as it is today, this paints a picture of God I am unable to accept. If a global flood did happen, God must have falsified the evidence. And I cannot accept God as a liar. However, doesn't this put God into a position where he's lying either way? Well, not exactly. What isn't commonly understood is the context in which Genesis was written. In fact, a lot of our ideas of the Noachian flood impose a lot onto the text that was not originally there. The statement alone of a global flood would have meant nothing to a people who did not know of a round earth. To them, the world was Mesopotamia. In fact, the Israelites viewed the world very differently from how we do. To them, earth was a flat plain, supported by pillars and enclosed in a water-filled, dome-like firmament. In fact, this firmament is integral to the biblical flood, as, in fact, this firmament is from which the rainwater from the flood descended. And so, why would a literal interpretation of the flood be accepted if nobody accepts this interpretation of cosmology anymore? Also, it cannot be ignored that Genesis is one of the younger flood epics. Many of the other Mesopotamian tales precede it by a considerable margin. Now, this isn't to say that the Israelites ripped off the Babylonians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Sumerians, or etc. But as John Walton states in Ancient Israelite Literature in its cultural context, quote, "What I am suggesting is that the similarities are conceptual, not specific. This observation in itself would tend to favor the third option, that the traditions stem from a common source," end quote. Basically, the Israelites repurposed the stories told by their ancestors to convey themes given to them by God. In fact, the thematics are a very important aspect of this. Not a single other story from the same time or area tells of sin or the evil of humanity. In fact, many of them say that the flood came because humans were getting too noisy for the gods. Context is key, and understanding how the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia viewed the world is essential to understanding the nature of the biblical flood. They saw the world very differently from how we do, and told their history in a different way and for a different purpose than we do. Now, some of you may now be thinking, well, in the end, who even really cares if the flood was literal or not? What you mean by this, of course, is that as Christians, we all agree on the important things. Whether the flood was literal or not has little to do with accepting Jesus Christ as our Savior. I agree. However, I believe that it is our duty as citizens of a civilized Western culture to place a greater emphasis on the importance of scientific acceptance. The lessons learned from the Noachian flood about God's power, how he views sin, and ultimately his grace are not lessened whether you believe the flood was literal or not. The Bible's authority is not devalued. However, our conclusions must be drawn from the evidence, not the other way around.